Brought to you by
Proto Labs. Real parts, really fast. Custom metal, plastic, and liquid silicone rubber parts in as fast as 1 day.
Hi everyone, welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between objects and storytelling. And first a little bit about what makes me tick. I like to think of myself as a maker futurist. We're hearing a lot about futurism today. And basically what I do is I'm a product designer. I have an affiliation with the firm Smart Design, and I also run my own studio where I just simply love to tinker with new technologies and think about how it's going to change our lives. And then when I get excited about it, I just have to share it. And so I figure out projects that allow me to share that. I'm kind of a technology pusher. And what I use a lot are stories. And the way I think about it is that stories are really reality plus emotion. And they allow us to take something that exists in the world and then add our emotion to it to really share it. So one of the things I've done in my career is I've worked with some pretty hardcore teams that are doing social robotics. So this is a project from Georgia Institute of Technology that's called Simon. And I was the creative director and the person who thought about what should it look like and how will it approach you. And I wrote a piece for the New York Times about how I saw the robotics that I was seeing in these really high-tech labs being applied to everyday objects. And instead of showing pictures of circuit boards and motors, what I showed were these stories of everyday life that seemed really friendly and were really based on real projects that are happening at laboratories or by designers. A lot of these actually in the year that since this article came out have emerged in the world. And the stories work on two levels. So they work at an intellectual level, so they help people understand the technology, and they work on an emotional level, so they get people to really care enough. And when they see a circuit board, they don't really care, but when they see bicycle handles that help them navigate, they think, oh, I could use that. That's kind of interesting. So in the process of doing these robots, I used 3D printing. So this work was, some of it was 7 years old, and it's been continuing since then. And as part of the process, I would use 3D printing to do scaled models, and I used 3D printing to do full-scale models, and I loved it. It was always really magical. But these prints were very expensive, and even in the work that I'd done in places like Smart, we used 3D printing with caution because it was expensive. The machine was the size of a refrigerator, and then this moment happened, and I felt really excited once again, like this same excitement that made me feel like I have to do something about this. This is going to change everything. I'm not really sure how, but I think it is, and I'm going to do some research. I did some research, I talked to a lot of experts, and put together some vision of what the future would be, and I realized that it would be exciting to actually put these visions in the hands of kids who are our ambassadors to the future. So I created a children's book about these future scenarios in desktop 3D printing, and it's called Leo the Maker Prints. I'm going to tell you quickly about the project, and then what I'd love to do is share a little bit of the process and how the stories work in ushering the objects and the ideas into the world. So it's really a storybook. There are 2D hand-drawn illustrations, and then there are also photographs. And anything that's a photograph is something that exists on the cloud online that people can download and 3D print. It's a story about a young woman named Carla, and she meets a robot, a walking, talking robot on the streets of Brooklyn named Leo. And Leo says, draw me a sheep. And for those little Prince lovers in the room, you'll recognize my homage to Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. So she says, oh, I don't do anything creative. I don't know if I can do that. And he says, yes, 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 please, you can do it. So she draws the sheep, and then before her eyes, he has a tail that heats up, and he moves this tray above his head. He's got a spool on his back, and the nozzle starts to move. And lo and behold, the sheep that she has drawn from her imagination begins to materialize. And it exists as this real sheep. And then from there, she says, oh my gosh, what is this? This is amazing. I need to know more. And so Leo tells her all these stories about all these other robots that exist in different neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And they do different things. Some print with different metals. Some allow people to have their own microfactory. Some are 3D printers that live in homes. Some are at a store. Some have scanners built in with the printer, etc. And the characters themselves, even though they were just really part of the drawing and they weren't part of the visions, can also be downloaded and printed. And the moment I'm in now is really, it's out there in the world. It was published by Make in December, and people have the book and they are making the objects. So I am getting to see sheep that pop up in France and in China and the UK and in Iowa and in San Francisco. And I've been doing a lot of readings with kids, and there are Carlas with different colored dresses and little Leos. And it's been a phenomenally satisfying experience to have this connection with my audience. And also for me, as a tinkerer, I am kind of tinkering with the world now and seeing, well, who 3D prints things? Why do they 3D print them? What are they 3D printing? And what are they doing with them? And one of the interesting things that people have been doing with them is they've been taking my fiction and then turning them into reality by printing the objects, so they have these objects that they can hold. And then they're bringing them back into fictional world. So one of the things that people have been doing is making stories with the objects from the book, which makes me incredibly happy. So this was the moment that I was waiting for when I put the sheep out there in the world. I said, the sheep was designed, it's white with black legs. Someone's gonna make the black sheep. So not only did this was the first black sheep that showed up, not only did they make the black sheep, but they made it with this sort of nefarious act that happened in the background, which I just really loved. And then this is from a fellow in Virginia who goes by Design, Make, Teach, and he uses a lot of the objects to actually teach kids about technology. And he's been doing a lot with Leo and Carla. So here's Leo supervising the creation of a new dress for Carla. And here's Leo. He not only prints in plastic, but he can print in snow. We all know that we had a pretty bad winter, so at least someone's having fun out there. Here's Carla, and she's just gotten a nerd award. We love that. Here she is appreciating some art. Even though she's nerdy, she can get out there and understand culture. Here she is with the Mars One project. And then this is one that just came out a couple of weeks ago that someone sent me an email and said, we're a library in Dundee, Scotland, and we're the first library to have a 3D printer in the UK. And we've been using your book, and we love it. And we've actually been doing events with visually impaired kids. And what we do is we read the story, but we also have the objects printed so that the kids can be touching the objects and they can feel them in 3 dimensions while the story is being written. And this was just something that I didn't even conceive of when I did the project. And it just was amazing to me to see how people are able to be creative in their own way with what's out there. So what I wanted to share for you guys, this particular audience, is just a little bit of behind the scenes of the process. So the first step, of course, was research. So I called friends who work at a number of different 3D printing companies. I talked to all my designer friends who've been using 3D printers. I talked to folks at Georgia Tech and MIT and Cornell. And started to get a sense of where is this heading? What are people really going to do with these 3D printers? And I also made sure to get my own desktop 3D printer. Even though I'd use these high-end ones, it was important to really have a hands-on and be using it every day. And for those of you who have a desktop 3D printer, yes, it was a lot of this. But that's part of the process, and that's how you know when you're a pioneer, is when things are just a bit of friction. when you're pushing forward. But what I learned from these experts is that we see 3D printing for sure in our future in this desktop low-end 3D printing way, but we're not really sure how. Everyone might have a 3D printer in their home, like a printer that we have with our paper. They might not. There might be 3D printers in every store corner. There might not. We might have 3D printed food. We're not really sure, but we know that something is going to be there. So what I realized is that there were these possible futures that we could define and identify. So I worked really hard to narrow those down, and I picked what I thought were the most significant for a general audience. So it starts from the most mundane and then goes to the most fantastical. So we start with an inventor who uses his 3D printer to prototype, which is something that we're all familiar with. And then we have a jewelry designer named Stephanie, and she has a microfactory. So her 3D printer is allowing her to not have to use factories and then ship things out and then have them shipped back, and then she can ship directly to her customers. And then we have the 3D printer at home, of course. There's a little girl, she can print out toys. We have a local store services. We have a customizing, so this is a robot that has Kinect-type camera scanners and can also 3D print. So it can do like highly customized things, prosthetics, etc. We've got 3D printed food, of course. And then and I came across my research scientists who are studying how we might have 3D printing on the moon, being able to sinter the lunar dust that is on the surface of the moon and not have to bring any other materials up there. So I took all those into account, and then I thought, okay, well, how do these things fit into a story? And so this was, for me as a designer, something that I had to work really hard on. I had a wonderful team on this project. I hired a woman named Cindy Hansen, who has a great background in children's theater, as well as a strong writer. And she worked closely with me on the story. And you know, it was also important to me to think about the shape of the story. If I was going to inject 7 objects, how am I not going to have it be boring? It has to be a real story that's engaging and immersive. So this is something that I learned about kind of after the fact. But when I reflected on it, I thought that, yes, see, this is what we do intuitively when we write stories. So there's a great lecture online by Kurt Vonnegut where he talks about the shape of stories. And you have this timeline. The story's beginning to the end is on the horizontal, and there's good fortune at the top, and then ill fortune at the bottom. And he goes through some examples of stories. But my story being inspired by The Little Prince, I thought also about the structure of The Little Prince. In The Little Prince, he goes and visits different planets, and in each planet there's a different kind of character that exists there, and it's its own world. And so I have sort of the classic hero journey in a way. There's a beginning, and your character doesn't start out quite so great, not necessarily above the line, but she's okay, and then she actually falls off her bike. And passes out, and then wakes up and meets Leo, and that's how things happen. And then there's this part of the story where Leo tells her about all these other robots and these other neighborhoods and these scenarios. And so that's kind of these steps. And then we end up, at least in my version of the story, with infinite happiness through creativity. So the next thing I had to do was develop this human-object relationship. I mean, I wasn't just going to talk about these futures. I really wanted them to be manifest in objects, and I really wanted the objects to be something that people cared about and they wanted because they loved the characters in the story that used those objects. I wanted them to identify with them. So as an example, one of the characters I have is Nathan, who works with Iris 7. Iris 7 is the scanner 3D printer robot. And Nathan, you see, lives by the beach. He lives by Coney Island. And he loves to go for these long walks on the beach. And, but he likes for his friends to be able to find him. So Iris 7 is able to scan his feet and then develops these shoes that have an octopus print. And this way, his friends know that it's him. And his friends loved it so much that they wanted one for themselves. And they were able to do starfish prints and shark fins and that kind of thing. So everybody had their own identity there in the sand. And I worked really hard on this one. You know, there were a lot of different things that we were going through in terms of, because what we knew was that we wanted this customization. So we thought a lot about prosthetics. We thought a lot about, you know, can you have extensions of a hand? Should we do a claw? Should we do fins? And then, you know, that's where I worked really closely with Cindy and thinking about the story and realizing, well, you know, it has to be something that this character really loves and is really personal. So that's how I made the decisions on what objects to do. And then, of course, the last step is actually developing these objects. So it was interesting for me as an author. A lot of my authorship was not necessarily in words. It was actually in drawings and in CAD and in printing. So I wanted to just share a little bit about the nuts and bolts and the nitty-gritty of these objects. So the sheep is the iconic mascot for the project. And I hired an assistant who's a product design student at Drexel University, Alexa Forney, and together we did a lot of brainstorming, a lot of sketching, and you know, how can we showcase what the technology can do while also having something that's fun and friendly. And so we just did, you know, we thought like maybe it's an algorithmic sheep, and then we bring that part, because in addition to the 7 core scenarios, I also had other things I knew I wanted to interject, like, you know, using algorithmic design, which we heard a lot about in the last talk. But I settled on this kind of fluffy, bubbly sheep, and you know, made sure to design things that were appropriate for a desktop 3D printer. So you'll see that the legs are quite chunky at the bottom, and then they sort of taper up to the top. And you know, I started with forms and then subtracted them, and then did these kind of press fits so that the nose actually snaps into place, etc. A lot of test prints, of course. And then, you know, a lot of subtracting and seeing. I wanted things to be multiple colors, you know, at least 2, but I also wanted to keep it simple. So I did a lot of designs that involve separate parts that can snap together. Then I have the Leo robot. So the Leo robot was really fun for me because I design robots, and they're usually these real-ish robots that are in, you know, and I thought I'm going to design this fiction robot. Also, I grew up in the era of Star Wars, and I have a collection of these books that have these droids in them. So this doesn't show up in the book, but I actually really love this because the design of the character itself had to be the thing that would actually illustrate how 3D printing works. And so we have this little guy, and he's got camera vision, so he can scan things, and he's got these arms, and he's got this tray, and he's got a heated nozzle on his back, and he's got a spool of filament. He's an FDM-type robot. And what he can do is he can take a drawing, he can hold it up to his eyes, then he can take the tray and flip it up this way, and the tail goes and does the print, and then he can present it back to the person. So for this, there was a lot of drawing. There was a lot of starting with a blank piece of paper and thinking, well, maybe the spool's on his head, and he has these arms, and he prints on the ground, or maybe he's got a tray on his arm, and the other thing is so it's sort of like a pastry chef, or maybe it's his tongue that sticks out, and there's like a spool up here, and what I really wound up focusing on was the gesture between the robot and the person, and that's when I realized that this whole thing with the tray. And also the position, like where a person might be standing. So the top right there really kind of represents where we wound up heading with the robot and the robot anatomy, and it's all about this sort of gesture and relationship and the social interaction between the robot and the person. So that was a lot of fun. And then I also wanted to make sure we did some movable parts. So it's broken into pieces. I do a lot with press fits where when they snap into place, they kind of expand into a hole. And so it's been really fun for me seeing when I do events with little kids because they take the things and they bang them. And so I'm getting a lot of extra research on what's robust and what's not robust. And the Leo model is pretty robust. And then I have Stephanie's jewelry, which I'm actually wearing today. And like I said, I knew that I wanted to use algorithmic design as part of what's part of our future. And I also wanted to have a woman who loved math, because I love math. And so what I did was I pulled out a book, actually, that I had in graduate school that's called Mathographics. And I revisited it, and I revisited the algorithms in there. And then I pulled out Rhino Python. So I went online, I tried to figure out, well, what are designers using? And I found that Rhino has a Python plugin. And so with this, I was able to find a formula for what's called Fermat spiral and experiment with this. And so I just plugged in these formulas for these graphics and then started playing with it. So the book I have was really 2D, and it would allow me to map out formulas. But then what I would do is I would go into the code and I would add a third dimension. And I would see, or what things could I play with? Can I play with the diameter? So I started with these sort of shapes that were repeated. And this was one of the first things that emerged from there, which needed some tweaking. But eventually, I managed to make the things kind of fat enough so that they could all be Boolean together. And then this was the jewelry that I wound up going with in the book. And this is printed using the Shapeways service. So some of it's actually sintered, and then some of it is cast, and it's sterling silver. What I'm wearing is the sterling silver. But it was really important to me also to show a variety of materials. And then I really wanted to do 3D printed food. So what I did is I went online, and that was another thing really satisfying about this project, was being able to just have the world as my oyster and say, okay, well, Cornell University is doing 3D printed food. I'm going to call them. And I actually managed to engage the fellow who is leading the food research at the Cornell Creative Machines Lab. His name is Jeffrey Lipton, and we worked out a way to work together. And so he taught me a lot of things. He said, well, there are these types of foods that won't work, and it should be something that can bind really well. It should be, and you can't, and then we did a series of brainstorms together. So it was really important to have this PhD student on the brainstorming team with me, so that we really understood that it wasn't just designers sitting around going, yeah, let's 3D print it. I mean, I really felt like whatever we're going to do, I'm going to send to you so that you can 3D print as food. And the result was this chess set, which in the book appears as plastic, although we do have a food version of it. There was a lot of FedExing of food going on, which is challenging. But this is a chess set, and our food designer, Emily, who's inspired by a friend of mine, designs a chess set. And when you win a piece, you eat the piece. And the board is actually made of crackers. So eventually you can eat all these cheese and crackers. And there's cheddar cheese and there's jack cheese, so you have sort of the really yellow stuff and you have the white stuff. And what I learned from Cornell was, you couldn't have any overhangs. There was a thing that they called 2.5D. So all of these are designed to be 2.5D. So there are no overhangs, and they will work together. Then the next thing was this title typography. So I called this a happy accident. So the first thought, I knew I wanted the title of the book to be in 3D. And then I played around a little bit, and I worked a lot with my book designer, actually Nicholas Lim, on different types of typography. And we started tapering the letters because the pure block letters weren't so interesting. And then this moment happened, which would happen, which is that the printer stopped working. And it stopped at this moment. And I thought, that's actually kind of cool. And then I tried to do it again on purpose and started Instagram. And people said, that's a really interesting font. What is that font? And I said, it's not actually a font. So what happens when you taper letters and the printer stops in the middle of it? And so I printed it again without the infill and started playing around with it in some layouts. And this is what we wound up going with for the cover of the book. So the last thing I wanted to share with you is, and we use it as the logo as well, is the hamster house. So in the scenario on the moon, there's a little boy named Charles. His mom is an astronaut architect, so they moved from Brooklyn to the moon. and he gets to use the 3D printer sometimes. And so he's going to print a home for his hamster. So I was working with Alexa, and I said, you know, we cannot design anything without understanding our user. And in this case, our user is a hamster. We need an intimate relationship with a hamster. I don't know what we're going to do. We have to find a hamster owner. And then she said, my roommate and I, we're talking about getting a hamster. I said, oh, you're getting a hamster today. That's it. And she still owns Weenie, which is short for Arduino. And we did a competitive analysis. We looked at what's out there on the market. The inspiration comes from the movie Oblivion, I think it's Oblivion, so I thought, let's have something with kind of like a ribbon. Here's some of the sketches. Let's have this kind of ribbon and have it like, see if we can do it floating. And then, you know, what it wound up being, and then we had to understand connections. And, you know, this wound up settling into being kind of these capsules that could be modular and could stack or go together horizontally. And so we worked really hard to get the mechanics right, because there are all these pieces that fit together. And that's the final result with Weenie in her star shot. And that's what I had for you today. Thank you.